We discovered that there were secrets that your body was trying to tell you that could really help you optimize performance. But no one could monitor those things. And that's when we set out to build the technology that we thought could really change the world.
Welcome to the Whoop Podcast. I'm your host, Will Ahmed, founder and CEO of Whoop, where we are on a mission to unlock human performance. At Whoop, our clients range from the best professional athletes in the world to Navy SEALs to fitness enthusiasts to Fortune 500 CEOs and executives. The common thread among Whoop members is a passion to improve. What does it take to optimize performance for athletes, for humans, really anyone? And now that we've just launched the all-new Whoop Strap 3.0 featuring Whoop Live, which takes real-time training and recovery analysis to the next level, you're going to hear how many of these users are optimizing their body with Whoop and with other things in their life. On this podcast, we dig deeper, we interview experts, we interview industry leaders across sports, data, technology, physiology, athletic achievement, you name it. How can you use data to improve your body? What should you change about your life? My hope is that you'll leave these conversations with some new ideas and a greater passion for performance. With that in mind, I welcome you to the Whoop Podcast.
How did you work out, but also how did you eat? How did you sleep? What kind of stressors are you dealing with, emotional and physical? And by measuring recovery through the autonomic nervous system, which is what we're doing, we're getting all of these different inputs sort of mushed into one and creating this holistic measure of how ready your body is to adapt.
How are we doing today? The subject of today's podcast is one that I know many of our listeners will be very excited about. Recovery. Whoop VP of Performance Kristen Holmes and Director of Analytics Emily Capodilupo team up once again to take a deep dive into another of our defining metrics, recovery. Kristen and Emily discussed exactly what Whoop recovery is, how it's calculated, and the significance of heart rate variability, the relationship between strain and recovery, and how to use it to optimize your training, external factors that impact your recovery, and several tips for what you can do to improve it on a daily basis. When it comes to recovery, there's nobody more qualified than Kristen and Emily to help you get the most out of your data. Without further ado, here are Kristen and Emily.
I'm Kristen Holmes, VP of Performance here at Whoop. I'm joined once again by Emily Capodilupo, our Director of Analytics.
Hello.
Today we're going to talk to you all about Whoop recovery, how it works, what it measures, how to use it to train smarter and more efficiently, and finally, some tips for what you can do to improve it. So Emily, as the mother of the recovery algorithm, is that the right terminology? Explain to our listeners exactly what recovery is.
Sure. So a recovery is a measure of your readiness to respond to a training stimulus.
Okay. Basically, when you wake up in the morning, you're going to get a Whoop recovery, and it's going to be bucketed, from 0 to 100, kind of superficially. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that, but you're going to get either a red, a yellow, or green.
Right, so the recovery score is on a 0 to 100 scale. We break it down into sort of a stoplight scale. So there's red, which is just the bottom third, 0 to 33, yellow in the middle from 34 to 66, and then green to the top third from 67 to 100%. And that just kind of makes it easier to talk about, but there aren't really hard lines between the different colors.
It's not like discrete categories.
Yeah, you really do want to think about it as this continuous scale. And it's measuring how ready your body is to respond to a training stimulus, how ready your body is to take on strain, which is related to sort of, how well you handled the strain of previous days and the stressors of previous days.
Right. And I think it's probably important for folks to recognize that it's not just your workout strain from the previous day that's going to impact next day recovery. And we've actually seen this in some of the studies that we've done where the training, when we've measured external load that was happening during a training session, there's actually no direct correlation between that training load and next day recovery, which means that what you're doing during all of these other hours of the day, the other 22 hours, for example, are really, really important and absolutely influence next day recovery.
Right. That's kind of why I almost don't like the word recovery, because it makes it sound like sort of you did something yesterday and then it's did you recover from that or not? But not everything is you sort of go into this debt from, a workout, and then you have to like undo the workout. It's a lot of this sort of cumulative measure. And so it's like, how did you work out? But also like, how did you eat? How did you sleep? What kind of stressors are you dealing with, emotional and physical? And, even just kind of being like stressed at work can affect recovery and all these different things. And so it's sort of this, by measuring recovery through the autonomic nervous system, which is what we're doing, we're sort of getting all of these different inputs sort of mushed into one and creating this like holistic measure of how ready your body is to adapt.
Let's talk about the inputs. So you mentioned HRV. So what actually goes into Whoop recovery?
So it's three things, primarily HRV, heart rate variability, and then resting heart rate taken during sleep, HRV and resting heart rate taken during sleep, and then sort of sleep performance, which is a Whoop score that measures what we call like duration sufficiency. So of the sleep that you need, how much sleep did you get? So throughout the day, we're measuring how much sleep you need based on things like sleep debt, things like naps, things like strain, and then also, your own demographic information, age, gender, fitness level, and coming up with this sleep need measure. And then while you sleep, we measure how much sleep you're getting. You sort of divide how much sleep you got by how much sleep you needed, and that's your sleep performance score. And the algorithm's biggest input is heart rate variability. And resting heart rate and sleep sort of cumulatively or together make up less than about 15% of the weight of the algorithm. And the reason why we do that is because HRV sort of contains a lot of information. And the information provided by resting heart rate is most of the time redundant to the information we're getting from HRV, but HRV has more day-to-day variability, and the information from sleep also tends to be redundant. And so they're really only useful in certain cases where like they stop trending together, and then we sort of use that information. But most of the time, it's really like if you look at your HRV on Whoop and you look at your recovery score, you'll notice that they seem to be super highly correlated, and that's just because they are.
Totally. And Emily and I did a podcast on HRV, so definitely recommend that. We're not going to go into too much detail about HRV specifically, but at a high level, it's basically when your HRV is high, it means your heart is responding optimally to the signals that your nervous system is sending to it. When it's low, your heart is not as responsive to those signals. And that's kind of we measure that by looking at the time between the heartbeat, essentially, the interval of time. So we won't talk too much more about that.
Yeah, I recommend that you go listen to that podcast because we talk all about the recovery score and sort of how HRV and how we use resting heart rate, how we use HRV and sleep there.
Great. So I think the magic of Whoop recovery is that it's completely individualized. I think it'd be good for us to just talk about how we get a baseline, why is that important, and kind of how to use that to drive some of your training decisions.
Sure. So the idea behind the recovery score is it's sort of how ready your body is to adapt to this training stimulus, sort of relative to your sort of most ready state. So over in the fixed term, your fitness and sort of the maximum amount of training stimulus you could respond to is fixed. And obviously with training, you can increase that capacity, but in the short term, it's unchanging. And so what we're really measuring is like as a percentage of your capacity, where are you on that scale of like 0 to your maximal capacity? And so with the calibration period over the first 4 days where we gray out those recovery scores is that we're trying to get an estimate of what that maximum capacity looks like so that we understand like, oh, you had a resting heart rate of, 48 beats per minute and an HRV of 92 milliseconds. Like, is that good for you? Is that bad for you? Because, with resting heart rate, we have like a little bit of a sense of like, oh, it's in the 40s, you're probably pretty fit, in the 70s, maybe less fit. But like HRV can vary a ton from person to person, having nothing to do with fitness. And part of that is because HRV is actually a signal that originates in the autonomic nervous system and then manifests in the heart rate. And that pathway.
So it's a function of the heart, essentially.
Right. Yeah. So we're measuring it at the heart, but it's actually a function of the nervous system that manifests in the heart. And so because that pathway can sort of be stronger or weaker, having nothing to do with fitness, you can't just look at a single HRV value of like 92 milliseconds and then sort of say like, oh, wow, like this person's ready for something or not ready. If it's like 4 milliseconds, you might have a sense that they're not ready, but sort of outside of a very extreme value, it's pretty meaningless until you start to build that context. And then once we have this context of like, okay, like when Kristen's really awesome, her HRV's in maybe the like 90 to 100 millisecond range and her resting heart rate's in like the low 40s or something like that, then you start to understand, okay, she just had a resting heart rate of 50, which you might think is like really, really good, but for her it's not. And so to start to kind of build out that context lets us individualize the score. And so what you'll actually see is that most people's average recovery is somewhere in like the 60s. And that's just like mathematically what we force it to be. So like looking at your average recovery compared to someone else's average recovery is sort of meaningless, because the whole idea is that it's personalized, and then what really matters is sort of day to day where you are on that scale, and like trying to move your baselines in a direction of greater fitness.
Right. So I think we definitely get this a lot, obviously, working with teams. Everyone wants to compare HRV. And I know we said we weren't going to go down talking about HRV, but I think it is maybe just worth mentioning again, why would you not want to compare HRV? And obviously you mentioned, heart size, genetics.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what are some of the other factors that are really going to influence HRV, and why should we not be comparing from one person to another?
Well, it's just that like the data suggests that higher HRV is sort of generally associated with better things. And there's a lot of research that sort of sees that.
Cardiovascular health.
Right. Sort of cardiovascular health and HRV have this like sort of noisy but, positive correlation. But what we see is that like just your HRV as like a single measurement does not predict performance on any kind of like athletic activity or cognitive activity. There's no research that's sort of shown that like one single value kind of means anything. But we have seen a lot of data that sort of shows that when your HRV is higher than like it's been in like, on average over the last 6 weeks or, 2 weeks, different studies use different kinds of baselines. But, when your HRV is elevated relative to where it's been, that you're going to perform better than when your HRV was, at baseline, and, better than you would perform when it was below baseline. And so we try to sort of ignore absolute HRV values completely when we're looking at data across athletes, and sort of to say that like, well, your HRV is sort of in a good place, so I can predict that you are going to perform better than you've been performing in practices on days when it was like lower because you had higher cumulative load. And, this other athlete who might actually have a higher sort of in absolute terms HRV than you, but if that HRV is below their baseline, I can anticipate as a coach that like they're going to perform less well than they have in practice. And so these kinds of information can be really helpful when you're picking like who gets to start in today's game or something like that.
Yeah, we've definitely seen in the research that we've done internally, I think the MLB Major League Baseball study that we did in 2016 is probably one of the better examples where we've been able to take a relatively large data set, and there's a very strong positive correlation between Whoop recovery and some of the things that they track in baseball. We're able to factor out a lot of the noise, so we look at exit bat velocity, exit pitch velocity. So if you want to talk a little bit about that study.
Yeah, so it was at least to date, and I believe still the largest study that the MLB's ever done on physiological data. And we looked at players' HRVs, and for the pitchers it was like their fastball throwing velocity, and for the hitters it was their exit velocity, so the speed at which they were hitting the ball. And obviously weather and a couple things can come into play, but the biggest variability in like why, one day your fastball is going to be faster than another day should be you. And so it's, how you slept, how you ate, how you've been feeling, cumulative load, all those things, things that we try and capture in recovery. Mm-hmm. And we saw this positive relationship for each athlete with like their HRV and their either bat exit velocity or fastball pitching speed. Mm-hmm. But not when you try and like mush all the data together with HRV, because then you get the player-to-player variability. So if you normalize all the HRV data relative to each athlete, you see this beautiful, strong correlation. But if you just sort of mush speed with the fact that his HRV was like 82 today and someone else's speed with the fact that it was 64, like there's nothing. Right. So it's pretty clear from analysis like that HRV is not all by itself a useful metric. It needs this context, and the recovery scores really comes to provide that context.
Yeah, and I think that's where there's enormous opportunity, for number one, just to be aware of how your body is trending, right, and how it's responding and reacting to not just training stimulus, but all sorts of other lifestyle factors, right? They're going to influence your HRV, but your resting heart rate, and also the quality of your sleep, which is, again, together is Whoop recovery. So I think what's interesting is, okay, we've got this MLB study that shows this positive correlation. I'd be remiss not to point out that we see this really anything with a finish line. So in the pool, the track, we're able to kind of factor out a lot of the noise. We see this on the free throw line. And honestly, I think that's what makes Whoop recovery so sticky, and why we're so successful operating within teams is that there is this correlation. And the fact is, when you've got a couple days where, you're in the green, I think most people I've spoken to, they feel fabulous. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of worth getting yourself to a point where you are actually firing on cylinders and you understand what that feels like, so you can line up your behaviors to try to replicate that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about just this relationship between strain and recovery. And one of the popular questions we get is, why does a rest day not always improve my recovery? And then this is a little bit of softball for us, but let's tackle it.
Sure. So a couple reasons, recovery, like we said, it takes into account everything. And so for a lot of people, a lot of the time, the strain that we accumulate while exercising can be the most significant strain in your day, in which case you would see this sort of cleaner relationship between strain today and recovery the next day. But for many of us, there's so many other factors. And even if for your typical workout, if you're working out an hour and a half per day, that's such a small, 5-6% of the day. If you're only something that you do 5% of the day isn't going to be the only thing that reflects a metric that sort of reflects in a metric that's a summary of the whole day. And so it's, how did you sleep that night? That's going to really affect, if you didn't work out, but then you also sort of use the fact that you had this day off to go out with your friends and stayed up late and then slept poorly, ate poorly, all these things, your recovery is going to be bad, reflecting those choices. And it's going to sort of, the fact that you didn't work out is sort of dwarfed by these other things. Things like hydration status, things like mood, even just you could do absolutely everything right, but you're fighting a cold. And you may or may not know that you were exposed to a cold for a few days, and you might not actually ever get sick. Maybe the reason why you didn't feel like working out yesterday and sort of took that rest day is because you're actually sort of run down because you're fighting something. And so then you're still fighting that the next day, and that gets reflected in recovery too. So I think in general, we do see a relationship between strain the day before. It's silly to think that something that you're spending 6% of your day on is going to perfectly correlate to something that's summarizing the entire day and everything before it.
Right. And I think that's what makes this concept of day strain so powerful, is that you're seeing kind of in real time how you're responding to various stressors, how hard your heart is working across the day. And I think it's really, if you notice, or if you wake up and your recovery is lower, the fact is your body is just not going to work quite as efficiently. So it's really an opportunity just to prioritize, some of the things Emily mentioned. Maybe you're going to really think about your hydration, for example, get a lot of water on board, make sure you're eating healthy, whole foods, non-processed. You want to give your body the opportunity to put all of its resources toward recovery and regeneration. And if you're putting a bunch of crap in it and you're not prioritizing these different recovery type opportunities, you're going to basically potentially delay tomorrow's ability to kind of be at what would be your maximum recovery.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too. And I think if you define a rest day as the day on which I skip my workout, you're sort of thinking about it wrong, right? You want to take that hour and a half that you're not spending in the gym or that hour that you're getting back and actually put that towards recovery, and then you'd expect to see that after a rest day you get a better recovery. But if you're sort of skipping your workout, just watching an hour of TV or sort of doing nothing with that time, or kind of worse, using that hour to do yard work, which is just exercise in a different form,
right,
then it's sort of silly to expect any kind of recovery boost as a result. It's totally fine to do yard work, but I think one thing we saw that was really funny when we did analysis of taper in collegiate sports teams, that a lot of these athletes, it's their schedules are so packed all the time, and all of a sudden they're in this taper period prior to NCAA championships. They have so much free time, and they use it to go have girl time and go shopping and do all this stuff, and that their day strains were actually just as high as when they had team practices, because they have all this energy and they're using it to do things instead of saving up that energy, which is sort of the point of a taper.
And that was, by the way, just a phenomenal, to be able to show the data and actually be able to we were able to correct it 5 days in. We're whoa, guys, your strain is so high. We need to dial it back. You need to think about how you're spending your day way differently, because right now we're actually not tapering. So, but yeah, I think that.
But I think, so a rest day is sort of just the baby version of a taper. That if your goal of your rest day is to boost recovery, then you actually have to take actions towards that. It's not merely the inaction of not going to the gym.
Right. And one of my favorite teams on the platform, their rest day is just littered with different recovery modalities. All the athletes get into they're in the training room more on an off day than they are, almost when they're training. So this idea, when you are struggling to kind of rebound from the various stressors and stimuluses that you're putting on your body, it's just, you have to actively recover, and that's really, I think, where this data can kind of help you understand what path to go down, so you're positioning yourself a few days later to be in your best possible spot, to perform.
Yeah.
Another really popular question we get is, I had an awesome night's sleep. Why am I not in the green?
Yeah, that is a common question. So for a couple of reasons. So I think there's sort of two separate questions that are related but a little bit different in there, and I want to answer both of them. So first is like, how is it that I could get a perfect sleep score and not a green recovery score? And I think it's worth pointing out that our sleep score is just measuring like of the amount of sleep that you needed. Did you get that sleep? And it doesn't explicitly sort of measure the quality of the sleep. And so we have other measures for that. We have obviously time spent in slow wave sleep and REM sleep, which, we encourage our users to look at. We have sleep efficiency, sleep consistency. And so you want to make sure that sort of sleep across the board is sort of as good as possible. It is possible to sort of get the sleep you needed, but not sort of have gotten the restorative benefits that you needed. And sometimes that's because you actually are more than one sleep away from recovery, right? Like, we all know that like when you're feeling sick, you sleep a lot, but I can't just like expect to get over a cold by tomorrow because, I got my 8 hours. It doesn't really work that way. So sometimes the amount of like accumulated recovery you need can be greater than what can be repaid in a single night. And one of the things that's just physiologically interesting about sleep is that like you can only get a certain amount per day. Our bodies will not let us just like stockpile sleep or like get more sleep than we need.
There's a point of no return.
So we can in fact be accurate that you did in fact get all 8 hours that you could possibly have benefited from, and you wouldn't benefit from getting another hour or two. So the sleep score is correct. You got all the sleep you need, check that box. But the reality is like, you really have been beating yourself up for weeks or, for days or whatever it is, and you're not eating well. You can't just sleep and ignore nutrition and ignore hydration and ignore all these other things and then expect to be green. So some of it is just like sleep is a huge component. We can pretty much guarantee that you're not going to be green if you're getting horrible sleep, but it's a big one, but one of many things that contribute to recovery. And so if you don't have these other pieces in there, you slept great, you might feel rested. There's still other need for recovery. The other piece that's sort of in that question is sort of sometimes you're going to wake up feeling great, like you feel really rested, really ready to go, and the recovery score doesn't reflect that. And that can happen for a couple of reasons. Sometimes our bodies are really, really good at compensating. And so we will be sort of almost like hiding from ourselves the fact that there's this like bubbling up need for something. And it's sort of like how when, we get exposed to some disease or something, right? And then it might take us like 4 or 5 days to actually get sick. That whole time, our bodies are actively fighting off the infection. It just takes like that long to start sort of losing, and then you start to feel bad. But what we actually see often is that like HRV will tank, and therefore recovery will tank a few days before people start to report that they're getting sick. So sometimes it's just that your body's working really, really hard to sort of compensate. It's not always disease. Sometimes it's just, physical stress, like you worked out really hard. And so there's a lot of like inflammation and, repairing processes going on. But we're doing a good job at those things. So while those things are going on and we're sort of yellow or red because of it on the recovery score, we're able to sort of rally enough resources to be productive and to feel good. So we see that a lot, that like the recovery score can be more sensitive to what's going on in our body because HRV is more sensitive to these things than we're often consciously aware of. And usually within a day or two, you almost like catch up to your recovery score and you're like, oh, it all makes sense now.
Yeah.
So we actually hear that a lot. I think I told this story on a previous podcast, but like we had, one guy was like really mad that his recovery score was all wrong because he felt great and it kept telling him he was red. And then like a few days later, he was diagnosed with mono. And it was like he felt really good and was like sort of incubating this kind of really unpleasant disease. And the recovery score was showing that like a few days before. And so I think like, what I sort of always tell people, and what's definitely been true in my own data, 6+ years I've been on Whoop, is that like 9 out of 10, if not like, 19 out of 20 days, you should wake up and like kind of already know what the recovery score is going to tell you. Because if it's like more often than that, like you're probably just not very in tune with your body, which is not a good thing. Right. But like, I think in the normal case, most of the time you're going to wake up and your recovery score is going to say something and you'll be like, yeah, I knew that. And it's those moments when the recovery score surprises you that it's the most valuable, and so to have that moment of being like, this isn't wrong, what's going on and what might be going on and how can I respond to this in a way that's going to let me take advantage of this? Because if every day, 10 out of 10 or 20 out of 20 days, you looked at your recovery score and you already knew what it was going to say, then it's actually useless, right? You don't need something to tell you what you already know. And it's those real like little moments. And if you can kind of action those, I think that's where you can really get the most benefit from tracking something like this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, context is always extremely important, right? When you're looking at one single day and one single value, recovery is chronically low, a few days in a row, for example, look at your training. Okay, maybe my body isn't adapting to the stimulus as well as I thought it. You can kind of evaluate your programming, or as Emily mentioned, looking at the restorative sleep, looking at your sleep consistency. Am I accumulating sleep debt? All of these things are housed inside the app for you to look at. So if you are, struggling with recovery, really dig into the quality of your sleep, because that could be potentially the answer for you. Because you could be, again, meeting sleep need, but potentially not actually getting the type of restorative sleep that you need to actually position yourself to recover properly. And then again, looking at your training as well. So if recovery's low, look at your training, what kind of stimulus are you putting in your body? Potentially you're not adapting. And then also toggle over and look at your sleep in a little bit more in depth, and that can kind of potentially give you the keys. And then there are these other factors, like the hydration and nutrition, and are you matching your stress throughout the day, appropriate amounts of rest? I mean, these are all things that, again, kind of come together to help position you to optimally regenerate.
Yeah, and I think sort of to add, everything you said is true, but to add to that kind of the emotional piece as well,
right?
And sort of that mental health piece, because sometimes, when you're dealing with a lot of psychological stress, you can rally and you can get through a workout and you can feel relatively good, but like I said at the beginning of this podcast, what we're really measuring with recovery is your ability to action a workout, not necessarily to grit your way through it, although that's related. But when you do work out, you're not getting stronger, you're getting weaker, and you're creating all these little micro tears in your muscles, and you're sort of doing damage. And then fitness comes from when our body comes in and then repairs all that damage and builds us back up stronger. And so that process that happens after the workout, and primarily, when we sleep after the workout, is a tremendously demanding process. It uses a lot of resources, which is why it's really important to hydrate and eat well and all those things after you work out. And your ability to sort of allocate those resources to those processes so that the input of one run equals this much, more running fitness. You need to be in a state where your body can do that. And so if you're really kind of emotionally run down, and all this stress and high cortisol as a result, we don't then allocate those resources to the rebuilding, and we sort of either don't fully rebuild or we don't rebuild stronger. We kind of do this bare minimum. And so for all of the training inputs that you're doing, you don't get the fitness gains. And so it becomes a less efficient way to train. And so there's a whole bunch of pieces. If you are sore and then you wake up not sore, your legs feel good. But that ability to sort of action that workout stimulus and build that muscle is sort of different from or your legs not sore anymore. And so I think sometimes too, when people sort of say oh, I slept well, or oh, I feel good, it's because they're focusing on one thing, and maybe something that had been bothering them and now is feeling relatively good. And they're not sort of taking that moment to zoom out and looking at all these other pieces. And what's so cool about HRV and why Whoop doesn't shut up about it, right, is because it takes all of these inputs and it mushes them all into one place, because that's what our autonomic nervous system does. And it says this is the high level view of where your body is and how ready it is to be challenged.
And when you think about, and this is what we do with elite athletes, every day, on the team platform is we're using HRV to understand exactly how a person is adapting to training, as well as all these other external stressors that we're talking about, right? It's not just training, it's how they're managing all these other lifestyle factors. But I think in terms of smart training, using this data and looking at your trends to see how you're responding to different stimulus, depending on, of course, what your physiological intent is. What am I actually trying to get out of this training block? Am I trying to get fitter? Am I trying to maintain? Am I looking to taper for an event? This data can be really a powerful way to get the most out of those training blocks if you understand how to use it. And really, it's just looking at your trends relative to your baseline. Mm-hmm. When there's a big deviation from your baseline, that means your body's probably not adapting. You prioritize rest. It's not quite that black and white or that simple, but that's the gist. And I think that's how the common person who doesn't have exposure to coaches and sports scientists, that's how you use the data. Because the HRV, for the most part, we've already been able to validate that we're really good at taking HRV from the wrist. And so you can kind of trust that. If you're wearing Whoop correctly, you're going to get really good feedback on how your body's responding. So it's, I think, a huge opportunity to train smarter. There's also some really good literature out there. Emily, do we want to point people to maybe some papers where, people can go to look a little bit more deeper into and how to think about HRV and training adaptation?
There's a white paper on our website, whoop.com/validation, where we talk about how we came up with, so for those of you who are members already, the weekly performance assessment that you get on Monday, that very first graph that shows the relationship between recovery and strain and sort of maps various areas on that graph to undertraining, target training, or optimal training, and then overtraining. So all of the sort of research that went into sort of the development of those curves and sort of all the literature that inspired that can definitely be found there. So I'd encourage people who are interested to go look there and dig deeper.
And I think that's, when you think about technology as a way to foster performance, I mean, it's helping you understand, I think helping to bring to light questions, that you maybe wouldn't otherwise know to ask about your body. And I think that's why I love being in this space, is there's always something new to learn. And maybe that's a good segue into kind of our next piece, talking about, okay, how do we make improvements in recovery? How do we accelerate? How do we facilitate recovery? And there's a lot of different things that, that I've learned just being in this profession for as long as I have in terms of trying to, win games and optimize potential and things like that. And then, being in this space where I'm more kind of consulting with teams. But I think there's a lot of things that we can do during the day to set our system up to really optimize the regeneration process. And I think I'll maybe just start off talking. I think autoregulation is probably one of the most important factors. When you think about setting your system up to work efficiently and optimally, it's food timing, it's, exposure to light, and sleep-wake timing. I think those are, three of the things that I encourage listeners to research, because if you can auto-regulate your system around those kind of three pieces, you'll be basically giving your system the best chance to focus its resources on regeneration and recovery. So I think those would be three areas that I would encourage users to dig into. And then we can just maybe go down a laundry list of tips, potentially on... do you have one you want to share? We can just go back and forth.
I'd say before we sort of jump into this, I think, so much of I think what a lot of our users ask about, it's if I have this recovery score, what does that mean about how I should train? And it's about reacting to the score. And I think it's so important to highlight the fact that your recovery score isn't this sort of randomly generated prescription every day, in that you just sort of the weather, it just sort of happens and now you have to respond to it. This is so completely in your control. And so thinking about it not from this perspective of Whoop told me I'm red, I shouldn't train, but thinking about it from this perspective of I need to be green on Saturday. How do I make that happen? This is something that it shouldn't be random. It shouldn't be surprising. Obviously, sometimes we get sick and you just get saddled with a red score despite doing everything right, and that's just a bummer. But you can be green 3 days in a row if you're intentional about it. So.
And that's what it goes back. I think in order to be intentional, though, you have to understand the factors that are actually influencing your performance. And I think that's where we come at. Okay, what are the things that actually influence our performance? What is going to influence my ability to get a green recovery in 3 days? And to Emily's point, that it is largely up to choice. There are external forces that we potentially can't control, but for the most part, if you have the information, it's just a matter of making all these little micro choices throughout the day that are going to set you up to be kind of your best version.
Yeah, and there's so many things that we can just sort of tell people, right? You point them on the right direction. If you drink alcohol, not going to be good for your recovery. If you,
and
aren't sleeping consistently
for days. If you have a heavy night out, it is going to take you a good 5 days to get back to your baseline.
If you're not sleeping consistently, you're not sleeping enough, that's going to hurt recovery. Right. If you're not eating well, that's going to hurt recovery. But one of the things that sort of I love about Whoop is that there are these great rules that apply to everyone. We haven't found a single user who benefits from getting hammered. Right. They're not out there. Yeah. But there are all kinds of things that are sort of your unique microbiome and genetics and, environmental factors and all these different things can make things that are, globally harmless or beneficial, problematic for you. One of my best friends, can't have walnuts, which, if you go Google health benefits of walnuts, you're going to see very little, short of
really
nut allergies. It's going to tell you avoid walnuts, right? But, for her, there's this weird food sensitivity thing. And so playing around with, I heard this advice, what does that do to my Whoop recovery? And using the data to help refine. So, you can start out with these great overarching sort of universal things. Figure out your sleep. Don't get hammered before a game. Like, that's not that hard. But I think like where you can really get a lot of the benefit is figuring out, how does Kristen respond to these things? And like, would I benefit from eliminating gluten? Would I benefit from eliminating dairy? If I go on a keto diet, does that actually affect my recovery? And, I think the reason why, like, you can Google these things and find smart people who say that this is the best thing ever and smart people who say that this is bro science junk is because like it actually does work for some people and not others. And sometimes the only way to know which one of those you are is to give it a try and then to sort of watch your Whoop data or be really intentional about how you run these sort of personal experiments so that you can figure out that like, oh, I spent a lot of time and money figuring out how to go keto and it didn't work for me. And, somebody else spent a lot of time and money figuring out how to do it and it's, paying off a ton. And then like, not looking at your neighbor and being like, oh, I must be doing it wrong, but sort of understanding that like our bodies are different and, we have different needs.
Yeah. I mean, just on the nutrition side, it's highly complex and individual. It's, your genetics, there's so many factors that go into, how you're going to respond to certain foods. And I think Emily's
like
point
a practical thing too, right? Like if a diet's going to take like 40 hours of like meal prep and like all this stuff, but like you're not sleeping because you're doing like, I think some of it too is just like what actually is going to work for you. What can you change? What's practical. Yeah. And then like what else are you sort of giving up to make this happen or not?
Right. I think like fundamentally it's understanding, okay, what are the principles, right? Mm-hmm. And then, okay, I understand enough of what these principles are. And then, a lot of it is just figuring out what's going to work for you, especially as it relates to, I think, to nutrition. And there's lots of folks you can meet with. There's lots of tests that you can take to try to accelerate your learning and in terms of what your body is going to respond to, what it's not going to. And I definitely would encourage going down that path, so you're basically cutting down on your experimentation a bit. But being able to use the data, and it's not a perfectly controlled scientific study by any means, but you will usually see it will manifest in your sleep potentially. It will certainly manifest in HRV. Again, HRV being just such a sensitive marker, as it relates to all these different inputs, everything that you're kind of doing to your body, it's going to react and respond to. So you can kind of use that as a marker of how you're responding and reacting to these various modalities or just ways of living. Maybe we just, talk maybe our 3 best tips on how to improve next day recovery.
Okay, so going to bed at a consistent time.
Yes, so sure. Sleep consistency, massive. It's in the app.
Yeah, it feels really boring to say like sleep consistency.
Sleep-wake timing, I know.
Like hydration and diet, but I really would say it's those. And then if we're sort of going beyond,
but it's actually like
boring,
really
obviously.
Like it creates like when you can regulate those, and I guess it goes back to my original point. Like if you can regulate those 3 things for the most part, you're setting yourself up like you're basically your body. There's just a bunch of clocks, right? And if you can regulate your sleep wake timing. Okay, that's one clock, right? And then that's going to basically set off all these other clocks, related to your gut and your brain and your hormones, right? So I think the synergy that's enabled when you get your sleep-wake timing as consistent as possible is just, it's through the roof. It is the lowest hanging fruit. And I know we talked about consistency before, but...
super cool. So like obviously sleep consistency helps maintain the stability and health of your circadian rhythm. And one thing that, my mentor told me like a decade ago was that, every single cell in our bodies has a circadian rhythm. And so, a lot of people say like, oh, circadian rhythm, that's sleep-wake timing. But it's not. Like circadian rhythm, which just literally means like, it's like circa dia, so roughly 1 day. Yeah. So it's just like, that's your just 24-hour rhythm and it exists in every single cell. Yeah. And so it's like you said, we anticipate food and like release certain enzymes in the timing that we're expecting food. And so if we eat at these sort of random times and our bodies can't anticipate the arrival of food, then like we don't digest as smoothly. And so you're more likely for like the same meal to sort of not digest it as smoothly. So then to feel bloated or like heavy or just like, constipated or It's just all these like things that come from like when you get this sort of big task, like it's like anything else, right? Like if somebody tells you like, hey, I need you to do this next week, prepare for it, you prepare for it. If I just dump it on your desk and I'm like, do this now, you're like panic and you don't do it as well, right? Like our bodies do the same thing with this like arrival of a meal into our gut. Even things like when we start to do things like growing our hair and nails, like which is happening all the time. And sort of when we start to put resources into like, maintenance versus like, so it's like this anabolic state.
This catabolic
state. And we sort of, you can do these things more efficiently if your body is able to sort of know like, okay, I have like a break from digestion now, so I can go and do these other active things with those resources. Then all of a sudden it's like more food arrives and, it's panic mode.
So Emily, would you say that it's possible for, if someone's struggling with recovery, right? It's really inconsistent. They don't know, they have no idea why. Like if I'm green tomorrow, like I know why I'm green for the most part, right? Like, I can pretty much predict what's going to happen tomorrow just because I'm so in tune with my behaviors. But would you say that just this concept of the signals that you're sending to your body and being able to regulate that is a path to being able to understand what's going to happen tomorrow, right? Like the less regulated you are,
the more random
it's going to feel.
Of course, it's not actually any more random. It just feels more.
Yeah, totally.
But yeah, and I would say, there are exceptions, just like, any perfectly planned thing can just go south.
Of course. Yeah.
But for the most part,
So light exposure, maybe just talk about is massive, right? So when you wake up in the morning, expose yourself to the outdoors. Doesn't mean it needs to be, full sunshine to get the benefits, but you want to, again, cue your body that it's time to release all the hormones that are telling me that I'm awake, right? Yeah. The other thing, just as it relates specific to recovery, and just I'm thinking about this because I'm talking about the morning time frame, if your system is not recovered, maybe consider not layering on stimulants. So maybe potentially, not having coffee. And we've done some work with one of our professional soccer teams overseas on just this concept of stimulants and recovery and what that association looks like. And it's definitely, again, you're asking your body to do something that it's not prepared to do. So you're diverting resources to dealing with a stimulus when you actually want to be like recovering and regenerating. So that's just one concept. Allowing the natural release of these hormones like cortisol, for example, like give yourself a couple hours before you have that first cup of coffee. Again, let your body do what it's naturally meant to do on its own. And by prompting it with these simple environmental cues so you can get yourself in this kind of regulated state.
Yeah. One thing I find like kind of funny about, this kind of advice is that it seems like new parents really intuitively know this about their babies and then like forget that it still applies to us when we grow up, right? Like with little kids,
so
it's like,
true. Such a good point.
we do like bath time at 4:00 because it helps them calm down. And then like, we put them in their pajamas and we read them a story time because
we
it
eat at very regimented times.
It's nighttime and we make sure that like they've eaten, at these regimented times because like, it keeps they're
in balance,
right,
and
keeps
they're
their systems happy. And like, we have these like strict schedules and we like, cue them that like, night time is coming and like with this whole ritual, and then we have a morning ritual and, we help ease them into the day. And then it's like, we think we like grow out of that. And what's so funny is like, these same parents who are doing such a wonderful job with their infants are then like, grabbing a granola bar where they can and like not eating well and, sleeping like, just like passing out, all these kind of random things. And like, we're actually still the same species as those babies. We haven't grown out of that. It just gets harder to do it.
Right.
But, it's still every bit as important. And if you sort of had that regularity, which is socially difficult, I don't want to sort of dismiss that. It is harder to do it when, you have a more demanding life than that of a 6-month-old. But sort of if you can make yourself do that, you're going to get those same benefits that we see those infants get.
Right.
You get cranky when you're off schedule. Like it just manifests differently because you have better coping strategies. But like all that same things that like make a toddler cranky, like it kind of, they mess with you too.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great way of explaining it.
I just like what I sort of love about forcing people to think about it that way is that like this isn't like this weird like newfangled Whoop thing. We're sort of, we know this and then we just like forget to apply it to ourselves.
Right.
This is sort of wisdom from forever.
Yeah. And that's why, I think it's funny because I think most folks who wear Whoop, use Whoop, just get completely addicted to the data, right? Because life is constantly changing, right? Like you might have a baby or, you get married or, whatever. There's all sorts of things that happen in life that shift us and that are going to change our routines potentially. And I think having just exposure to this data helps us understand how we might be coping with some of those changes, yeah? If maybe we're not coping as well, okay, we have we can take steps to improve it. And I think what's really cool, and I see this with elite athletes all the time, is that it's not going to take you 4 weeks to realize that you're trending in a poor direction. It's within a week, you're going to know, okay, something's not right. So it gives you this opportunity, I think, to course correct within a week's time, potentially, if you know that your body's not adapting to whatever it is that you're doing to it. And then you just have a choice for the most part on how you shift things so you can hopefully prioritize recovery and get yourself back on a good path. Great. Well, Emily, is there anything that you want to add about Whoop recovery?
So one question that we get asked a lot is like, okay, I'm red, what do I do? Or okay, I'm green, what do I do? And I think that, one thing that's really worth emphasizing here is that the recovery score is this measure of your state. And you can sort of use it as like a training prescription, but that's not really what it's meant to be used for. It's meant to be used in conjunction with your own understanding of what your goals are. So just because you're green, if you're supposed to be tapering right now, that doesn't mean like go all out. It means that you could safely go all out, but sort of that would be optimizing for too short term for most people. So it's like if you have a game on Saturday, use that green as an opportunity to know that like you're doing a good job recovering, you're doing a good job with your taper, but it's okay to take a rest day when you're green. And sort of similarly, there are times where it's totally appropriate to exercise when you're, yellow and red. It's just you have to understand that like if you work out hard, say when you're yellow, that like you're sort of that much less likely to be in this easy situation to action that. So, trying to take that opportunity to support that exercise by being extra mindful, with these other things that we've been talking about for the last hour, things like, hydration, nutrition, active recovery modalities. So, taking extra time to like do whatever it is you do, myofascial release and, stretching and all that good stuff. And then, when you're red, you also don't need to like stay in bed. Like you can focus on technique. You can focus on doing like a lighter exercise, active recovery type stuff. If your recovery is like in the single digits, you probably don't want to get too active, but you don't have to sort of do nothing just because you're red. And I think also, if you're intelligent about it, you're just sort of aware that your risk of injury might be elevated and that your body's not going to have a good response. You can also think about it as an opportunity to like train a slightly different system. So you're not going to necessarily, when you're red, get the most fitness gains for the exercise input, but you're also training when you're tired is a really important part of your marathon training. It helps train for grit. It helps train for like,
There's
the last 6 miles. So that mental
through.
Component of exercise, if we only ever work out when we're 90+% recovered, and then on game day we're 70% recovered, well, we've never trained in these conditions, so how can we expect to perform in them? So the recovery score is this really great guide. Am I globally sort of doing too much, too little? If I'm green every single day for a month, I'm probably not pushing myself that hard.
You're not making fitness gains,
right? I'm certainly not making fitness gains.
Right.
Because if I'm red every so often, that can actually be a really good sign. It means that, I had this tough stimulus and then I sort of bounce back from it. And sometimes bouncing back happens within a day and sometimes it takes a day or two, and that's fine. And so
if that red is from actually like a training stimulus, if like you got hammered last night like that, obviously.
No, that's different.
Clearly.
So, if you're in this period of like functional overreaching and you have a red and yellow days,
you're going to be living in the yellow.
Yeah, and that's normal. And so like you can train in those situations, but you just need to know that like you're adding a lot of this cumulative fatigue, and so you need to respond to that intentionally. And if you're sort of don't believe yourself to be functionally overreaching and you're getting all these red and yellow scores, then like why does my body think I'm working harder than I am? And that's like a really good opportunity to have this kind of like check in with yourself, check in with your coach if you have one. Similarly, if you think you're like functionally overreaching and you're green, you're not. So like having those conversations. So like having these kind of like this moment to say like, is the response that my body is having to what I'm doing consistent with what I like think I'm doing? It was a way of saying like, is my training plan in fact effective? And so am I going to get out of this block response that I expect to be getting? And while like on every day, there's this opportunity to action the information so that like you can control where the trend goes. I think, if you're sort of super like hyper acute into like, oh, I'm red, I shouldn't leave the bed, and oh, I'm green, I need to go run 15 miles, you're sort of missing the point.
All right, awesome. Well, Emily, thanks for the conversation today. This was super fun to be able to talk about recovery, and hopefully the listeners got a lot out of it. And certainly any questions that you guys have, shoot them our way, and we'll make sure we get them answered.
Yeah, so this podcast was inspired by questions from our users. So if there's any questions you guys want to hear, ask us and maybe they can show up on our next podcast.
Thanks again to Kristen and Emily for another great podcast, and make sure to listen to their previous episodes on strain, on sleep, and on HRV. If you're not already a Whoop member, you can join our community for as low as $30 to begin. We provide you with 24/7 access to your biometric data, as well as analytics across strain, sleep, recovery, heart rate variability, and more. The membership comes with a free Whoop Strap 3.0. We offer 6, 12, and 18-month memberships. The more you sign up for, the more you save. If you enter the code WILLAHMED at checkout, that's WILLAHMED, we'll give you $30 off a membership just for listening to this podcast. For our European customers, the code is WILLAHMEDEU, and that'll give you 30 euros off when you join. For our listeners in Australia, the code WILLAHMEDAU will get you 35 Australian dollars off your membership. And for our current members, you can upgrade to the Whoop Strap 3.0 and get access to all the new Whoop Live features by following the link in your Whoop app. If you're out of contract, you'll literally get the 3.0 for free when you commit to another 6 months. Check out whoop.com/thelocker for show notes and more, including links to relevant topics from this conversation and others. Make sure to subscribe, rate, and review the Whoop podcast on iTunes, Google, Spotify, or wherever you like to listen. We'd love to hear your feedback. You can find me online at Will Ahmed. I try to respond to everyone who reaches out. And you can also follow at Whoop on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. You can email thelocker@whoop.com with any thoughts, ideas, or suggestions you may have. Thank you again to all our listeners, to all our Whoop members. We love you.